Well, good afternoon and welcome to St Peter Mancroft Church for our talk this afternoon, which is all about what we have on our tables and tableware. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Mary Fewster, who is going to give our talk this afternoon. And Mary is a specialist in silverware and much more, as we're about to find out. So at the end of the talk, please feel free to come and have a look at the items we've got on display, as well as the Titcombe silver collection, which we've got on display as part of the Heritage Open Week in our treasury, as well as some of the items Mary is going to be speaking about later, which are actually normally in our treasury cases here as well, so you can go to see those. So may we welcome Mary in the traditional manner, Dr. Mary Fewster.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here and lovely to share with you things which perhaps we know something about, but perhaps pass over because they are so familiar. So I'm going to talk to you about the development of the dining table and what is on it from early Middle Ages up to the 20th century. Now, of course, dining, as we know, has for many thousands of years been a particularly important way of both sharing with other people and demonstrating your status. And we'll find there's quite a lot of that going on in the talk I give this afternoon. And I thought we'd start back with William the Conqueror and the Bayeux Tapestry and have a look, because there is a dining scene here. The Archbishop, it says, is blessing the food, and we have a typical sort of Norman dining table. And you'll notice they sat at one side of the table, and the other side we have the servant boy offering up food. And we look at what is on the table, and we can see it's very simple. There would be just the bowls and dishes with food on. There are bowls that they are drinking out of, and very little else. There isn't much in the way of plates. There's not much in the way of cutlery. They would use their daggers as knives. And if they had something liquid, they would, of course, be sipping it out of their bowls. And we know this style you can trace back hundreds of years before that, because in the Sutton Hoo ship burial, they found a nest of 10 silver bowls, which were actually made in Byzantium and then were buried with, we think, King Redwald in his ship at Sutton Hoo. And these bowls, these silver bowls, would have been on his dining table all those centuries before, and you can trace it obviously back, if you even read in the Bible about dinners and the sort of things that they had. So it's a very ancient way of welcoming guests, of welcoming subjects, and making it quite clear, that you are important because of what you can lay in before them, the table that is set before us. And the sort of bowls that they might have used went on being used right through into the 17th century, as you can see. This mazer, which is another word for this type of drinking bowl, was made in Norwich in the early 17th century. The wood I think is maple, and then it has this silver rim and sort of frame around it, and certainly a number of them would have had silver rims, just to make the edge perhaps a little finer than a simple wooden bowl. But the idea is the same, so even 500 years after the Bayeux Tapestry, we're still looking at a very simple type of tableware. At the moment, the castle is undergoing massive change, where they're putting in the original floor levels and restoring this great hall. And this is a generated image of what they intend it to look like, to replicate what it was like when it was built as a royal palace. The royal king's palace in the east is generally the idea about the origins of the castle. And it would have been used then, or was intended to be used, for him to come and show off his grandeur to the great nobles and people of East Anglia. And we know that the king came in 1120 to celebrate Christmas here and had a major feast and a crown wearing, it says. So obviously it's a special occasion when you put your crown on, and showed off to the people. And again, it would have been a one-sided table, this time three sides of a square, but again, the servants would have served from in front of the table, and everybody would have sat round, and you had the high table where the grand people sat, and then all around it the ordinary people. And again, there would be very little on the table. The big serving dishes, that you would have had some knives, perhaps, which you would have brought, your dagger, and probably a spoon. You would have brought it. It wouldn't be provided. It would be your own spoon that you would take along for the occasion. The sort of things that you would expect to see might be these great serving dishes. The picture on the left is from a medieval manuscript of a lady bringing in, it is actually a cooked peacock. It is not just sitting there. They were cooked and then they were redressed in their feathers and tail and brought in as a showpiece. And the sort of platter that she would be bringing it in on, it does look silver gilt, and it probably was very similar in style to the one on the right. But the one on the right has another interesting origin. It's actually in the cathedral treasury, and this is the collection plate from Oxnead. Now, Oxnead is a small village, and even with the wealthiest of people, I can't really imagine you needed a plate this size to do the everyday Sunday collection on. And so I suspect that it started life with the pastons at Oxnead Hall as a great dish, and then, as you will find, became quite common, was given to the church at some point as part of their communion set. If these pieces were not in use on the dining table, then you would make sure they were on show, because that was part of the whole idea of dining, was that you proclaimed your wealth to everybody by showing them everything you'd got. If you got it, flaunt it, you know. And this is still the case. This is, I got this offline, this is a picture of a banquet set up at Windsor Castle. So a royal banquet. And of course, you've got the tables, you've got the high table at the end there with the Queen, or what would have been with the Queen, the banqueting tables, but either side, the key thing, are the two buffets of plate. If you weren't using it, you put these great pieces of plate out on display on what were called buffets. That's just another name for a side table. And there is one on each side. It's not so easy to see that one, but you can see this one clearly here. And there's a matching one here. All the great gold or silver gilt or whatever it is you've got, you put out. And it wouldn't necessarily just be plate, it would be flagons, it would be any bowls, drinking cups, anything that you had got that you weren't actually using. And you can see this even went over into churches. After the Reformation, they didn't necessarily use an altar table up at the East End. You would have a table in the centre of the church for communion, if and when you had it, which wasn't often. So when you were just having a service, you would use the altar as a buffet. And you would display all your pieces of plate on the buffet. And this you can see at the coronation of Queen Victoria, this wonderful picture that shows Westminster Abbey. And here, you can see it in smaller there. There's the Queen and have the coronation going on. But here is the altar, absolutely covered in grand pieces of plate, which if you go to the Tower of London, you will see as part of the Crown Jewels exhibition. And people tend to walk past that bit which is sad, because they've got these wonderful Tudor flagons, feathered flagons, great, and they've got great plates and great candlesticks and things like that. And so in a way, they are using the altar as a buffet. Norwich Corporation was exactly the same. They had a collection of plate, even as early as 1544. We find that, because the corporation records, I have to say, go back well into the Middle Ages, and they are absolutely wonderful because they're so detailed. And so we find them doing a little inventory of what they own in 1544. And they own, and this is as a corporation, not the individuals, 3 goblets with a cover, 2 salt cellars, we'll come back to those later. Parcel gilt means partly gilded, it's white silver with parts of it being gilt. Gilding was a dangerous process. What you did was you mixed the powdered gold with mercury paste, and then you smeared it on the bit you wanted to gild, and then you burned off the mercury as gas. Lethal, but it produced then a cover of gold on the top of the silver. So if you just wanted the rim and the foot gilded, or you wanted a gilded band round the middle, that was what you did. And that's what parcel gilt means. So they had the salts, they had a spoon with St. Peter's image, in other words, a spoon rather like this one, an apostle spoon. This one is St. Matthew. This comes from the Tictum collection, and we've got a display of early East Anglian silver in the case in the treasury, which shows you a lot of different spoons, including apostles. So they would have an apostle spoon, and they've got standing, the bowl and a cup just is to do with the size and shape of the bowl on the vessel. Bowls were broader, cups they still were stemmed vessels, imagine like wine glasses, and one might be round, sort of taller and thinner, and one might be rounder. That's the difference. And then they had 6 diamond-headed spoons, and we have one here. This is late 15th century, probably, but that would be the diamond-headed spoons. And then a pounce piece, which is a sort of embossed piece with a parcel gilt foot. They also had these, they acquired these a bit later, and there's a wonderful story to these. The 2 cups at the top were given, as it says, by the Bleverhassett family, who lived out near Sixthorne, out that way. It was common for the local gentry to give the corporation pieces of plate, and the corporation would give the local gentry and the bigwigs pieces of plate as well. You know, it's that sort of reciprocal thing that you did. And they had these 2, and they decided they needed a 3rd because they had a mayor and 2 sheriffs at that time, and so you needed 3 cups of a similar style for the 3 top officials of the city. So they made use of a piece of silver that had been given to them by one of the councillors, who was goldsmith, and he'd had to give them a silver cup because he didn't want to be an alderman. If you refused an office, you had to pay a fine. This was quite a good wheeze on the part of the corporation, and you had to pay a fine of a piece of dining plate. So he duly handed over his silver cup. They then decided that they wanted it remade to match the 2 Bleverhassett cups. So they handed it to another local goldsmith, a man called William Cobbold, who duly remade it, as you can see, to match the other 2. And his cup, the Peterson cup, is at the bottom. And as was the custom, if you remade a piece of plate that had been given to you, you always put the name of the original donor on. And so William Cobbold duly wrote round the rim of the cup, "The most hereof is done by Peter Peterson." When people started getting interested in the marks on silver in the 19th century, they looked at the mark on this, they looked at the inscription, and they said, This means the cup was made by Peter Peterson. And so the Auburn cross mark, anything with the Auburn cross mark on, was made by him. Of course, they were entirely wrong, because it was actually William Cobbald's mark when he remade the cup. So that's why you do find Peterson cups around which were not made by him at all. So that one is always called the Peterson cup. And if you go in the treasury, you'll find that their communion cup, which was also made by William Cobbald, is also called the Peterson cup. Another thing that was often the subject of a gift and was a necessary part of dining was the ewer and basin, because of course most of the food was eaten with your hands and you needed to rinse your fingers from time to time. So a ewer and basin borne round by a servant with a towel hanging over his arm was an essential part of dining. So the corporation was in receipt of ewers and basins. One was given, the one on the left where you've got the drawing of a rather angular sort of ewer and basin. That was given by Matthew Parker, who was Queen Elizabeth I Archbishop of Canterbury, and was born in Norwich, and his parents are buried at St Clement's Church. And so he gave to his city this ewer and basin and made sure that there was actually a drawing made of it, because this was in the document of gift, and it said it was to be kept forever by the city. Well, unfortunately, forever, as far as the city was concerned, went up to the 18th century because they melted it down. But we do have the drawing. But a century later, the Howard ewer and basin was given by a member of the Duke of Norfolk's family, and that they still have. The boss in the middle is not the original because obviously when it was made, the central boss was a bit shallow and the ewer doesn't sit firmly on it, and if you're carrying it around, the ewer was sometimes on the boss in the middle of the basin. So they had a second boss made that goes over the first. So they've actually got two bosses on that. But that is still in the civic collection, which unfortunately is not displayed anymore because it was in the keep of the castle. So where it is going to be, I don't know. One of the key items, if you remember, they had in that list of plate that was owned by the corporation was a salt. And the salt, if you think about it, was symbolic as well as practical. We talk about being above and below the salt. And the salt was an object, was that little castle-shaped thing on the table. Another royal banquet is being shown in this drawing. You've got all the people, who mostly appear to be female, sitting around the table. You've got dishes down the middle of the tables, what's something that looks like spoons, at least on the right-hand side, and the round bits I don't think are actually plates. I think they might be trenchers, and we'll come back to trenchers later. But definitely on the main table where the royal personage, and I think it might be female, I'm not sure, is sitting, is the salt. So you were above it if you were sitting on the high table with all the grand people, or you were below it. And the corporation owns one of the finest, or the finest, pieces of provincial plate, and that is the Reed salt. And this is it, this great piece of show. And we know exactly all about it because it was in Peter Reed's will that he was leaving £20 for some piece of plate, being either a salt or a bowl with a cover, and my arms to be set upon the same, to remain and serve the mayor and his successors forever. Well, it does remain, and as I say, it's in their collection. Sadly, they won't let it out to serve the mayor on the table anymore. But we had an opportunity when there was an exhibition back in 2004 of East Anglian silver, and we had a great dinner in Blackfriars Hall, and the mayor came, and we took the opportunity. There were copies made of this, and one was owned by Christopher Hartop, who was one of the organisers of the exhibition. And so we took the opportunity, if not to put the original in front of the mayor, we put a copy. So there is the mayor with the salt in front of her on the table, as it should be. And the salt, as you can see, you can get some idea of the size of it. It's quite sizable, but it is nearly all show. A salt is just a salt cellar, basically, just to put salt on your food. And salt was an incredibly important thing. Firstly, it savoured food, of course, but secondly, it preserved food. So having salt, that's where the word salary comes from. Having salt was a significant thing. And this salt cellar, down to there, is cover. What then, in here, you have a very shallow dish for the salt, and the rest is just an empty drum of silver gilt. It's all showing who you are. You are the mayor of Norwich. And it was the custom in those days that the mayor could, if he wished, take home the regalia and plate, so that if he was dining at home with visitors, for example, he could have all the accoutrements of his civic office at home with him. So the reed salt undoubtedly turned up in the house of whoever was mayor at the time. But even much further down the social scale, a salt was an important item. And what you start noticing by the 16th century is that silver is moving down the social scale. And it's not just owned by the aristocracy, it's now the gentry and even wealthy farmers who could afford a piece of silver. William Harrison, he was, as you can see, a writer in the second half of the 16th century, and a bit of a misery, if we're being honest. If William could find something to complain about, he did. And what he particularly didn't like was this changing society. You know, people should know their place, according to William. So he was a bit iffy about this idea of wealth spreading through society. And as you can see, he comments about the changes in people's lives. One of the other things apart from the third thing, was that people had chimneys. But when he gets to the third thing, he says, it's the exchange of vessels as of treen, which is wooden vessels, wooden plates, into pewter, and wooden spoons into silver or tin. Woodworking, of course, is a good East Anglian thing. Spooner Row is called Spooner Row because they made wooden spoons there. That's just out near Wyndham, if you're not sure. And it says, so common were all sorts of treen stuff in olden times, man could hardly find 4 pieces of pewter. This is pewter. I'm sure most of you have seen it, at least in pubs, you know, where this is a pewter plate, pewter mugs. People, you know, that was the upper dining ware for most people, including merchants, families, and everything. The lower dining ware was this. We'll come back to those. But as you can see, he said they used to only have 4 pieces of pewter. Now they have a whole set of pewter on the table. And on his cupboard, which is again a side table, a cupboard, just a plain table which you put your cups on. And so much more odd vessel, a silver salt, a bowl for wine, if not a whole nest, which could mean that he was thinking of mazers that stacked, and a dozen spoons to furnish up the set. Now, there wouldn't have been a set of spoons. They didn't make spoons in sets. The goldsmiths made spoons. How many you bought was up to you. You could have 1 or 2. They didn't come in a set. And probably a set of spoons would have just been a collection of half a dozen spoons that would have had different origins and different dates and different styles. So that was his idea. And this is the sort of silver salt that Harrison would have been thinking of. They're not very big, they're about that big. They're not massive, but it would be, again, a symbol that you had arrived somewhere. This is a wooden trencher, a plain wooden plate. This one is a rather elegant one because it's even got a little indentation at the top for the salt in the edge of your trencher. And trenchers were the basic wooden tableware. And of course they've come back into fashion now, haven't they? You go to upmarket restaurants and they serve it on a wooden trencher and you're thinking, excuse me, this was the poorer end of the scale once. But your simplest one was the bread trencher. And this is where people were a good trencherman. They would have a large slice of bread, at least this size, probably much bigger. Loaves in those days were larger and heavier than modern loaves. In fact, there are plenty of references to quartern loaves, which is an 8-pound loaf. And they baked these, and then they would leave, it was stale bread they would tend to use because it was less porous. And you could pile your food on the trencher, and then when you finished, of course, the gravy had all soaked into the bread, so you could then eat the bread, or, and this was the other important thing, you would collect up all the bits and put them in the dole cupboard, which was a cupboard on the outside of the house where the poor could come and get the food that was left over from your meal. And of course, because it had the gravy and everything in it, it was nutritious as well, so you felt you were really doing your charitable best for the poor by giving them your broken meats, as they were usually referred to, the bits left over. This is a modern version where they've dug it out as out of a roll, really, or a small loaf of bread, and they've scooped out the inside and put the food in. But the more obvious one, and obviously you think of probably the loaves would have been that size. So you would have had a platter about that size to eat your meal off. And you can in a way see that this is French or Italian. There are lots of fleur-de-lis around, so it could be a French origin. But you can see the big serving dishes in the middle. And I suspect that these rather strange things that look almost like a whirl pattern on, I suspect are actually trenchers. And here you can see them refilling bowls. They didn't bring they didn't refill your wine bowl at the table. The servant took your bowl to a side table where they had the flagons of wine, and that would have been then refilled from that. You can see them refilling bowls. Now, when the main meal was over, a different sort of trencher was used. This is a display in the Castle Museum. It's in the Art of Living gallery, my favourite gallery, I think I have to say, because they have bits from all the different collections and really give you an idea about what it was like to live at particular periods. And this is a series, a collection of dessert trenchers. They've apparently found, I believe, in a cardboard box on top of a cupboard. As you do. But they are 16th, 17th century, and so when you'd had your main meal, you cleared the table, and then these desserts were brought out, and that would just be things like marchpane or marzipan, sweetmeats of various sorts, perhaps, fruits, and sweet wines. And so these beautifully decorated trenchers would be placed on the table. This is again belongs to the corporation, all this set, and then you would have what our equivalent of the coffee and mince. That's what one of them looks like. Ordinary families, of course, ate much more simply. This is, in the book I got it from, described it as a Puritan family. I'm not sure whether they were definitely of that religious persuasion or whether it's just a typical, simple family meal. But you can see that they, again, very little on the table. The bread was placed straight on the table. If you had a roll or something, you just put it on the tablecloth. You didn't have a plate for it. You would have a bowl or dish, and notice they're all using spoons. A lot of the recipes of that time are for soups and stews and pottage and various things that are liquid in base, so you would have it in a bowl with a spoon. Yes, and the children, of course, eat standing. It saves worrying about the height of the chair, doesn't it? You just make them stand up. And the type of spoon that they might be using, this is a 16th century one from the Tictum collection. It's called a slip end because it actually doesn't have a knot on the end. But it will be very similar in the 17th century of that period. They would have the same design of spoons, either wood or pewter or brass or, if you were lucky, silver. And if you were lucky, you had your own spoons. Spoons become very special because many of them, as I say, they weren't just like table silver. They were your own possession, and they were given to you at specific times, and you took your spoon with you when you went to dine. Here's a collection of spoons that were made in the Waveney Valley, which, down on Beccles Bungay way, and they're all slightly different. And this is what I mean about them not being sets. They might all have been made, even if the same goldsmith was making them, they might be slightly different. So we've got an apostle. We've got various, and the rest are various types of seal top, which they're called that because the shape of the end is rather like the signet seals that people carried on their belt. And they would often be engraved on the top with just the initials. But people would be given them on special occasions. This picture I love, but I cannot really place it in its, in one might say, a time setting. Clearly everybody is focused, the father and one of the sons are pointing at this child, as if it's her. And it's clearly her day, and she's clutching her spoon with determination. But she seems too old for it to be christening, because usually children of those days were naturally christened not immediately after they were born in case they died. Otherwise they'd have to be buried outside the churchyard and they might go to purgatory or hell. So, so normally they were christened as very young children, and she doesn't seem to be young enough. But it might be a birthday or something, but she is definitely holding her spoon for dear life. And it gives you the sense of the personal nature of these things, because while she's holding her spoon, one of the children has got a windmill. I'm not quite sure what the little, which I think is younger, this one, whether it's a spoon or a rattle or whatever she's holding. It's not really detailed enough for me to see. But christening spoons were important, and in wills, and I'm just glancing through the yeoman families. Yeomen are farmers, freehold farmers, so they're very much in the middle of society, and in several wills you find them making sure that people get the spoons that were their christening spoons. So for their children, they want to make sure that this doesn't just go into the general pot of the probate. It's specifically left 2 silver spoons that his godfather and godmother gave him. And particularly for women, because, of course, if women are grown up and married, they don't own anything. On marriage, everything they own becomes their husband's. So there's quite clear that he is leaving 3 silver spoons, which were her christening spoons, all the silver spoons given to her on her christening. These fathers want to make sure that the children get this special personal gift that was theirs. And this often shows up on the spoons. These are 4 spoons that were made by a man called Robert Dale in Woodbridge at the beginning of the 17th century. And 3 of them have got initials, 2 have got dates. So we've got EW 1613, TN, and 1601 EG. And that must indicate christening spoons. Sometimes you get them made for weddings. And I'm not quite sure who would use them if you get one spoon for a wedding, but never mind. And then they would have 3 initials on. They would have 1 initial at the top, and you sometimes see this on houses as well, and 2 initials underneath. The initial at the top is the surname, and then the 2 underneath are the Christian names of the couple. So you would find, if it says J and then underneath J.A., it would be, say, Jones, and then John and Anne. And you find that sometimes on spoons, these 3 initials, which suggests it was given as a wedding present. Now, apart from spoons, we've talked about, and bowls, standing cups, cups on stems, were an important part of the grander household. And here we have examples of them. Now, the reason we actually have these objects still existing is because they've been given to churches. We'll look at why people gave these things to churches, but the one on the left and the enlargement of its cover is called the Thistle Cup, and that's in St. Peter Mancroft Treasury. And as you can see, it was made in 1543. The date alone tells you it was never intended to be in a church. Added to that, you've got the figure on the top, this sort of martial figure in Roman armour, which doesn't really smack of churches either. But the reason it's not a church piece is that it's the wrong shape. In 1543, there was a specific shape for chalices, which was laid down by law. And it had to have a bowl, a stem, a big knop in the middle of the stem, and then at the bottom a heavy spreading foot. And something like this would not have been allowed to have been a church piece. So it's given after the Reformation to the church, probably around the end of the 15th or end of the 16th or into the 17th century, may even have been later. I don't think we know exactly what the date of the gift of the Thistle Cup. The one on the right, again, made in 1530 to 31, not intended for churches. This is an interesting piece because it's an unusual way of manufacturing it, because it comes apart. The bowl unscrews from the stem, and the acanthus leaf decoration is on a little ring that fits on the top of the stem, and then you screw the bowl on. And it was made in London, ends up at Wood Dorling Church, and there's another one, almost identical to it, but a copy of it, which was made by William Cobbold, the Norwich goldsmith, and that ended up in St Andrew's Church. So they've both survived. They're slightly different, although Cobbold copied it, the decoration is slightly different, but they've both, at some point or other, been given to churches, and that's why they're here today. Otherwise, they would just have disappeared. And another example of an even grander cup is the Glean cup, and we know when this was given because Peter Glean left it to the church, and it's in the treasury. And we know he bought it, we know who he bought it from. It was his father-in-law, in fact, Sir John Suckling. And we know that he intended it to be used as a communion cup, but it did not arrive in the church before about the second quarter of the 17th century, although it was made, as you can see, in 1625 to 6. And the same thing happens at St Peter Hungate, where the Lanes give a cup to their church that was obviously a secular cup that they were donating. And the same thing happens in St Andrews, where Nathaniel Remington gave his parish church his great standing cup that would have stood in front of his place at the table. And again, might have been the only big piece of silver gilt in the house, but it would have demonstrated his position and importance. And the reason we can identify the dates as between those years is because, although it was made in 1617, or 1617 to 18, he didn't become an alderman until 1627, and on the cup it says, the gift of Nathaniel Remington, alderman. So we know it was given after he became an alderman, and probably on his death. It was either bequeathed by him or his family decided to give it to the church in his memory. And you can go elsewhere in the county and find exactly the same thing, these big, elegant standing cups. Now, there might be another reason why they give these to the church, apart from either just as a donation of respect. At that time, about the end of the 17th century, the local gentry were really taking control of their churches, so they often wanted to replicate the dining experience in the church, because the whole idea of the communion service had changed from being a sacrament to being a commemorative meal. And if you have a commemorative meal, then you have a buffet of plate, and you have a big standing cup on the table, because that's what you do at home. And so there was an element of copying between religious and secular style there. But also, there's the third reason why you might end up with these cups surviving when they wouldn't have otherwise done, is that they went out of fashion. Now, this is the Beeston cup from Beeston St. Lawrence. And it was made in Norwich, as it says, 1635 to 6, obviously for the Beeston family. It was at Beeston Hall. It was then given in 1744 to the church. Now, it's definitely not a religious cup. It's got all sorts of fanciful, mythical creatures all over it. It doesn't look at all religious. It probably was given, let's be honest, because it went out of fashion. They didn't want it on their dining table in 1744. Fashions had changed by then. They were going in for other things, as we shall see. But they, well, what can we do with this? Oh, we'll give it to the church. So they did. But they didn't give the cover, little steeple cover, rather nice. That was discovered in Beeston Hall in the 20th century. So it is now reunited with its cup, and both were on display in the castle keep. But where they will end up now, I don't know. And if you were to be able to go into the cathedral treasury, because it's not open at the moment, but when you have a chance, if you haven't been, do go, there's a whole shelf of things that were made for dining, which, for one reason or another, have been given to churches, and therefore have ended up, being, when the church has closed or didn't want them anymore, or was, got other styles, they have been passed on into the treasury. So there we have the Wood Dorling cup, and we have the Remington cup. We have a very nice sort of wine glass shaped cup, early 17th century. Two porringers for hot spiced wine, these two handled cups, which were used by the nonconformist church as communion cups right through into the 19th century, because that was one way of demonstrating this idea of a meal rather than a sacrament. And then a sweetmeat dish in the middle, which was what you would have handed out, the sort of marzipans and little candied fruits and whatever on. As time goes on, more and more different items are made for the table. On the left, we have a very elegant tankard made by a Norwich goldsmith, Arthur Hazelwood, in the middle of the 17th century, and in fact made for a woman, which is quite surprising because it contains a quart. But it's got Elizabeth Cook's coat of arms on, so we assume it was her tankard, it is, it's a very upmarket piece, because you've got all that decoration at the bottom called cutwork. You've got the lion thumb piece on the handle, and it's now in the Gregory Peck collection in America. No, I didn't know he was a silver collector either, but we borrowed it back for the exhibition, so that's how I know. And then at the other, I was going to say end of the scale, not quite, but a small beaker, about that tall, made by Arthur Hazelwood, which would have been used by women or children for smaller drinks, at the dining table. All these things could be made in simpler metals. What you've got there on the left is a quart mug, but it's made of pewter. In the middle, you've got a horn beaker. Horn was used as a simple material for working class dining, as horn spoons also were made. And on the right is just a typical pint mug that you would find, and you often find them, don't you, in pubs being hung up on the wall now, but that would have been typical, simpler dining ware for people who were further down the social scale. But not at the bottom, because at the bottom you would be lucky if you were able to use horn or wood. Pewter plates, as we've said, were quite common. Pewter, when it's new, looks like silver. In fact, it's sometimes quite difficult to tell the difference. If you go and look at a display in a silver shop, sometimes they will also have pewter. And, they are bright silver, but they darken over time. So this is a modern pewter plate. But because it's new, it's bright. Whereas once it gets older, it gets greyer and greyer. But if you are more upmarket, you would have silver or silver gilt. And many of these either were made by the goldsmith and then somebody wanted a collection plate or a pattern for the church, and so they were sort of, oh, well, I'll put IHS in the middle of this one. This is in the treasury, incidentally, the one at the top right, and then it's a pattern. Or I'll put, he that gives to the poor lends to the Lord, and that's a communion plate. But if you actually look at them, they are just dining ware. So they may have started life at that way and been given to the church later on. The two on the left were both given to churches. They are much grander. They obviously were parts of dining sets. Probably continental, actually, probably Dutch. The one at the top left is in the treasury here, and it's got a bowl shape. But the one on the bottom right comes from a church in Suffolk, and that has got the coat of arms on, and I suspect was part of a big grand dining set that it ended up in its local church. As did these flagons. These are the Westacre flagons from the church in Westacre in West Norfolk, but you only have to glance at them and realise that the sea creatures and all the fancy flowers and things indicate that this pair of early 17th century flagons would look far more at home on the buffet, than it does sort of on the credence table in the local church. And that's where they started out, and then were given by one of the local gentry to the church. And flagons, as I said, were an important part of refilling the cups, refilling wine cups. And then suddenly things change. You get towards the end of the 17th century, and suddenly, within a few years, hundreds of years of tradition in a way. I know it's been altering over the time, and there's more silver, and pewter and silver are going further down the scale. But a whole new range of materials are appearing. You've got China wares, originally from China. The Dutch East India Company started bringing them back in the 17th century, and then you get the East India Company, and people were buying these porcelain pieces. And then you start getting factories in England reproducing those Chinese porcelains. And then what the delightful thing happens, that the Chinese sees these English copies of Chinese wares, and the Chinese then start copying the English copies for export. So then they send back Chinese wares that are actually copies of things like Worcester that were copies of Chinese wares. But nevertheless, you start getting things on tables which are made of silver. Forks appear. You've got on the right the older types of forks, two-tined forks, and the shape of knives alters. You don't use the dagger at the table, you have a table knife, and notice the shape. It gets broad at the end. That is so you can pick up things like peas on it. We always laugh about people who eat their peas off their knife, but that was what the knives were designed for, picking things up and eating them. And you can see, the whole ethos of the table starts to look very different. Napkins were always a feature, but they are starting to be presented as an attractive part of the dining experience. And you will then get central figures. I mean, this is a setup from a National Trust property. Originally, this sort of table centre would have been made of sugar. They liked making these grand confections of sugar, castles and ships and things, or of marzipan in the Middle Ages. They often had marzipan. And then at the end of the meal, you broke them up and ate them. Well, as time went on, I mean, this is expensive if you have to produce a new confection every time you have a dinner. So they started making them. Once you get things like porcelain, or bone china, you start making things of china, and then you can use them time and again, and that makes life much cheaper. And another thing that appears is glass. So you don't need your silver wine cup anymore, which is probably the point at which you give it to the church, because you've got a glass instead. And notice this greenware. Wedgwood then starts producing his famous creamware, which went all the way up and down the social scale. Queen Caroline had Wedgwood creamware on her table, and this is, as you know, it's a sort of earthenware. It's not bone china in the same way. And we get a totally different type of table setting. The blue and white wares, which originated from China and were copied and recopied and so on, and particularly willow pattern, become one of these staples and are still around today. The glasses, the table centres and so on, you've still got silver on the serving dishes, you've still got cake stands, you know. Some of the central things are still of silver, but certainly the rest of the tableware has changed dramatically. And with it, of course, the goldsmiths and people like that had to change as well. No more were people necessarily commissioning great standing cups. So you find Nathaniel Rowe, goldsmith in the marketplace, Norwich, probably at the north end of the marketplace, having lately bought at the last India sale, that's probably undoubtedly the East India Company's big auction sale, quantities of superfine tea, coffee, and a great variety of chinaware. So they are moving from being the makers of goods to being the retailers of luxury wares, none of which they're making themselves. And here at the top we've got a Worcester tea bowl, and at the bottom a Lowestoft teapot. And that tells us a new meal has come into existence. And here we have a wonderful portrait that's in the Goldsmiths Hall in London. It's a casual meal, this one, because you've noticed the gentleman has taken his wig off and is wearing a sort of turban, and they are all drinking tea. And again, you have to remember that people only put into pictures what they wanted people to see. And what this family wants everyone to know is just how refined and how modern they are. So they're all sitting around with their tea bowls, and on the table we have the teapot on its little stand, we have the coffee pot, we have the tea caddy, and then we've got the sugar bowl with its lid, the slop bowl, and a dish containing teaspoons. So we have all the accoutrements that we've laid out for you on the table here. The little china tea bowls, we've got the teapot and the coffee pot, and we've got a moat spoon as well at the front, which you haven't got shown to you. A tiny little spoon that would be for fishing the tea leaves out of the tea when it came through in the cup. It could also be used for fishing bits off the top of wine, the cork and things like that. But teaspoons, this size of spoon comes out. The normal size of spoon is this, was used for anything. That is your utilitarian 16th and 17th century spoon. So you can see now you have a whole new range of tableware. And this starts a trend towards a different piece of tableware for everything. Obviously, as I say, you have small spoons, you have tablespoons. We've now got, we're saying these spoons are put on the table. You do not bring your spoon with you, we put things on the table for you. We've got ladles, you know, and then you start getting a different knife and fork for every occasion. Oh, I've done it again. Oh, we're back. There are teaspoons. They're all in the Tictum collection. We haven't actually got them with us today, but little set of 6 teaspoons, and you are starting to get sets. So you buy a set of teaspoons. The ones on the right are from the book of the Tictum collection and were made in London. And we've got a spoon, though it's a slightly earlier spoon, with this very popular decoration on the stem. But you are buying in sets now. And I keep saying these pieces have survived because they were given to a church. The reason that things don't survive is that the wealth is in the bullion. It's in the gold and silver. It's not in what it's made into. Even today, you know, bring in your old gold and silver and we will melt it down and use it for something. And that's what happened to much of the earlier tableware. Giving it to a church, in a way, ensured its survival, though that certainly wasn't their purpose. So Nathaniel Rowe, who is buried at the back of this church, just under where that signboard is, he was told by the corporation to melt down a lot of the old, out of fashion stuff. Belly pots, which are jugs which had a rounded body. Salvers, pottingers, they're the two-handled things. 12 salts, 6 spoons, and then get some nice new up-to-date stuff. Sauce boats. And that's a picture of the sauce boats that replaced all this stuff. And notice they're all made in London. The next stage on is to make something slightly cheaper that can go even further down the scale. We've got Sheffield plate. Now, you would probably have looked at all that lot and thought, it's silver, it's Sheffield plate. And that was discovered by accident. A man called Bolsover, Thomas Bolsover in Sheffield, was mending a customer's silver-handled knife when he overheated it, and the silver fused into the copper that was underneath. And at that heat, it literally fused together. He could see the two layers, the copper and the silver, but they acted as one. And so, by accident, he discovered silver Sheffield plate. And this meant that you could have a silver outside, but most of the metal was copper. And if you were doing it on both sides, and this is modern silver plate, Viner's plate, you know, you just made it like a sandwich. You put silver on both sides and a copper bit in the middle, or sometimes it's nickel or tin these days. But, and then when you heated it all together, it still looks exactly like silver. And this is a bill heading from Isaac Marsh's shop in the market. That's where Lloyd's Bank is now. And he was selling a variety of London, Sheffield and Birmingham wares, plate, jewels, etc. So again, a goldsmith that's become a purveyor of luxury wares, not making them, but retailing them. They could make, they were still trained goldsmiths, but they tended not to do a lot of it. And there you see sauce boats, that the in thing. We've got some 18th century examples on the table here. Tea sets, this is Sheffield plate, 18th century. And if you were to look at a table setting, and this is the one that we've got in front of us down here, you cannot tell which of those items is silver and which is plate, but there's a mixture of the two. And so you get to the Victorian table, and you pile onto the Victorian table as many things as you can possibly think of. By now, you've got about 3 or 4 sets of cutlery either side of your place, which you then have to remember which one you use for which course, because that is part of the dining experience to show that you know which knife and fork to use. You've got a variety of glasses, 3 or 4 glasses per place. The napkins, nice, beautifully starched napkins have been made into fancy shapes with the roll stuck in the middle. And then you have all the serving dishes and a massive table centre. And this becomes the era of table centres that is extremely difficult to see over or round. But then, I have to say, perhaps a bit earlier than this, in the 18th century, dining was a social experience, and the rules of etiquette said that you didn't just have a sip of your wine when you wanted. What you had to do before you drank your wine was to make eye contact with another diner and raise your glass, and then they raised their glass, and then you both took a sip of wine. So if everybody had their heads down and eating, you couldn't drink. That's according to the etiquette. Whether it actually happened in practice, I don't know. So the Victorian table. And then by the time you get to the Edwardian period, and this comes from Mrs. Beeton's edition of 1905, you've got a similar thing, but it has become a little less fussy. And of course, oil lamps have replaced all the candles. So you're getting this lovely row of oil lamps with their fringed shades going down the middle of the table. But you've still got multiple glasses and multiple cutlery and some table centres with bowls of grapes and what have you. So, as I say, you then get all these serving implements. And what you have to remember then is that people didn't serve. You could have all this stuff because you weren't doing your own washing up. And you have all these extra bits and pieces that you have to use because you weren't doing your own serving either. You've got servants for that. And we perhaps underestimate the importance of service in the development of dining, not only for the people at the top table, but the servants themselves are learning. You think of people who perhaps come from a little cottage and they become a member of the great household, like this one I just happened to pick up online, at Curramore House. There's a hierarchy of servants. The housekeeper is served. If you've ever been to Wimpole Hall in Cambridgeshire, the housekeeper's sitting room is rather elegant, and she would have been waited on hand and foot. She might have done all the organising, but she didn't do a lot of the physical work. That was what you aspired to, becoming butler or housekeeper. But all the different maids with their different functions would have been learning all the time. How do you set out a table? Which knife and fork is used for which? How many glasses do you need? What do you do with a napkin? When they had their own homes, they replicated that in a simple way, but it was important that you set out your table and you had a napkin with a napkin ring perhaps, and you had a glass by your side, and you had a side plates that come in, set, according to Mrs. Beeton, not right next to the left of your dining plate, but slightly above it, sort of on the equivalent level as the glasses. And so you learned. The picture, that's from the spine of the Mrs. Beeton book, showing the maid laying the table. So learning this stuff. And if possible, you made use of anything you could get. This is an interesting indication of remaking. It started life as an ordinary salver, which sort of thing you would find on the side table in the hall, which you put the visiting cards on in grand houses, and somebody at some point has added a foot and turned it into a cake plate. But it's, the point is, where possible, you reuse things, or you made things, or you bought cheaper things, and increasingly the big factories were churning out cheaper things for you to buy. But who doesn't remember going to some great aunt who insisted upon, I might be talking to somebody who still does it, but anyway, insisted upon, you had the jam spoon and the butter knife and the pickle fork and all the extra little bits and pieces that you had to have, and around you when you laid out the tea table, or you laid out the breakfast table, or whatever. And so, you had coffee cups and tea cups, which were different, and all of these little niceties that people had picked up, many of them from serving in big houses. So you could share the delights of the dining experience, even if you were living in an ordinary house. And the Victorians made the most of what they could produce. So you have some weird and wonderful things as well. I mean, all right, you have, and I don't know if they're still selling them, but I remember them from my youth, sets of dessert spoons with scallop shell edges. This central spoon is got Judy on the end, so I'm assuming it's part of a pair, maybe a pair of, I don't know, salad servers or something like that, with Punch and Judy on, which you may have bought as a holiday gift. And then at the right-hand side, you've got these rather strange embossed spoons, which must have been a devil to keep clean. But, you know, it's just all part of this extension of dining. 20th century sees more new materials, chromium plating, Art Deco. Pewter comes back in the arts and crafts movement. Arts and crafts stuff, I mean, like this sugar bowl here with the sunflowers on, very much that sort of naturalistic idea, but pewter comes back in because it's traditional and very arty, basically. But chrome is the thing for the 30s. And like these standing figures. And this is a cheap and cheerful version because she's only flat with a plain stem up the back, but you've still got the typical 1930s lady of the sort that you see. Even modern times, what was developed as a typical dining table with all the fuss of the Victorians still survives in a very much pared down stylistic form. You've still got the tall table centres. Okay, you're down to one knife and fork, but you may present others as the meal goes on, which is the more modern version, rather than setting it all out at the beginning. The napkins still folded into a fancy shape, and so on. And the silver dishes perhaps down the middle, as well as china. And you even have a buffet, because where would we be without the buffet showing off your best bits and pieces? So, if you think about it, success is not reserved for a select group of people who have silver spoons in their mouth. The silver spoon was indicative of this privilege, but it was also practical because silver is antiseptic. And children who were given a silver spoon might well last longer than children who are eating off wood or horn because it doesn't attract germs. But far from being the silver spoon of privilege, it meant that the dining experience could be enjoyed by everybody. Thank you. You don't have to worry about it.
Again, it falls to me to say thank you to Dr. Mary Fewster for her talk this afternoon. I hope you've all enjoyed it, those online as well as those here in church. Tomorrow we've got Dr. Tim Pestle, who's the Senior Curator of Archaeology at Norwich Castle Museums, coming at 11:30, and he's going to be doing a talk, an illustrated journey through Norfolk's history, looking at a selection of objects that reflect our national story and also Norfolk's prominence in that story. So that's on Friday at 11:30, and then Saturday we've got the playing of the merry organ and sweet singing in the choir, which will be a talk given to us by Michael, our comms guy here, and he'll be talking about, well, both the church organs, which we've got, and also a little bit of the history of choirs and singing. So if you fancy that on Saturday morning, that's at 11:30. But once again, thank you for coming, those of you who are here, and also thank you to Dr. Mary Fewster, assisted by Sue Titcombe of the Titcombe Trust, with the silver that's in the Treasury. Do go and have a look at the table here before you go, or have a look at the bits in the Treasury. You're very welcome to do so. So thank you so much, Mary.
Thank you. do come up and have a look if you want to. Take the opportunity to go and see the treasury if you haven't been before, but you may have been.